Wired for Autism presents From an Autistic Point of View, a series of short presentations looking at what it means to be autistic, presented by an independent speaker, trainer, autism needs assessor, blogger, writer and postgrad student. Today I'll be discussing why a late diagnosis of autism is better than no diagnosis. 22nd of June 2022 marks precisely 40 years since my final day at my secondary boys' school. This date is forever imprinted on my mind as easily one of the very happiest days of my life. I remember taking my GCE O-level English language exam a few months earlier, and one of the essay questions was, "School days are the happiest days of your life. Discuss." Well, after the initial confusion that this question didn't actually mean discuss, I had real trouble answering it. For in my childhood experience, school days, especially secondary school days, were amongst the most traumatic periods of my young life, certainly not the happiest. Autism, particularly high-functioning autism, was virtually unheard of in mainstream education in the UK in the 1970s and the early 1980s. Indeed, it would not be until 1981 that the term Asperger syndrome was first popularised by the late psychiatrist Lorna Wing. Consequently, a whole generation of late diagnosed autistics went through our entire childhood and much of our adulthood feeling isolated, confused, bullied, misunderstood, lost, anxious, and with very low self-esteem. I struggled both educationally and socially to fulfil my potential. I was a bit of a loner with few friends, all of which I would confidently describe now as being, if not autistic, certainly neurodivergent. We each had narrow interests, were universally poor at sports, and had preferences for solitary pursuits. Although we were all academically above average, we struggled to achieve our expected grades due to the social and sensory difficulties of being in an overcrowded, noisy and hostile environment. At college, I was to engage with girls of my own age for the first time in 5 years, but found this to be difficult initially due to my previous experience. However, as I was undertaking a preparation for nursing course, most of my college classmates were female, and in one subject I was the only male in the class. The commonality of the course content helped some class friendships to develop, but much of the alienation I'd felt at the boys' school was very much less severe in the college environment. I was only taking the qualifications that were relevant or interesting to me, so academically I thrived. To this day, I have not failed a single theoretical exam or qualification since leaving school way back in 1982. As if proof was needed, this demonstrated that it was the environment that impacted upon my academic success rather than any deficiency in myself, although at this time I could not fully understand the reasons for this. During the mid-1980s, I went to Leicester to train as an RGN student nurse. The hospital environment had been like a second home to me growing up, as my late father had frequent hospitalisations, so I found the environment in itself clinical but reassuring. However, during my final year, my father had a period of sustained ill health, and there had been some irregularities around our final exams. Together, these resulted in my having what I now know to be major autistic meltdowns. Consequently, my nursing career ended in 1988, and I went through a period of self-loathing and depression. Had I been diagnosed as autistic as a child or in early adulthood, much of the difficulties I experienced in the first 3 decades of my life could have been looked at differently, with undoubtedly better outcomes. Instead, these difficulties were attributed as my personal failings. I had also compartmentalised much of my friendships. By this, I mean that I left behind my school friendships when I left school, and likewise my college or nursing friendships when I left those environments. This left me alone and feeling virtually friendless without the social skills to easily form new relationships. At the age of 28, I was to meet my future and current wife. And fortunately for me, we had travelled on the same bus to college all those years ago, so we had that history. We were also both seeking commitment and were happy on our own or just being in each other's company. We married within 2 years and had 2 children before the millennium. The pressure of being a father and the main wage earner hit me when my son was a baby. An intense period of workplace bullying led to my attempted suicide. Over the next few years, our marriage was tested further as both children were identified by the health visitor to be showing early signs of autism. A plea for help for our children from our local authority led to accusations of exaggerating their disabilities and false accusations of FII. I've written about this at length on various mediums, and I've talked about this on other podcasts. Although this experience was traumatic and the worst year of our married life, it was my decision to fight this perceived injustice with cold, hard facts rather than just emotion, which led to an enforced psychological assessment which suggested presence of autistic traits. Voluntary referral for an autism diagnostic assessment led to a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Finally, all those historical difficulties in social communication and social interaction, my special interests, my ritualistic behaviours, sensory and environmental issues were all starting to make sense. Clearly, my lack of an autism diagnosis, years of masking my behaviours, and the intense exhaustion, anxiety and social isolation had had a significant negative impact on my mental and physical well-being. At the time of my diagnosis, I had been suffering from depression and anxiety for nearly a decade and from the debilitating condition of chronic fatigue syndrome for 2 years. Although being incorrectly placed in child protection for a year was a very traumatic experience, it did lead me on the path of my self-discovery through my receiving an autism diagnosis. I was aged 42 when I was diagnosed, and it felt like a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I left school just as autism was beginning to be recognised as not solely limited to individuals with a learning disability, and the term Asperger's syndrome was beginning to gain publicity. So it would have been highly unlikely that the difficulties I faced as an adolescent would have been clearly identified, let alone understood, by anyone at that time. Looking back, what difference would it have made to my life had I been diagnosed earlier? Well, I would have known the reasons for my mental turmoil, why I had difficulties in forming or maintaining friendships, why changes of routine and crowded environments made me so stressed, and why masking in an attempt to fit in left me feeling totally exhausted. Undoubtedly, school may have been more bearable and my life chances different had my autism been recognised earlier. However, had my experience been different, I would have been unlikely to have met the lovely lady who has become my wife of 26 years and had the 2 wonderful children that I have. Neither would have met so many incredible autistic individuals and their families through being part of the autistic community. If anyone listening to me today is considering a referral for an autism diagnostic assessment as an older adult, I would encourage you to go for it. Autism is not a disorder and most certainly not a tragedy. I grew up thinking that I was defective in some way and was bullied at times for being different. Diagnosis put a name to that difference and enables autistics like myself to accept and embrace our neurodiversity. We are not defective, but simply wired differently. I am wired for autism, and that's a good place to be. Thank you for listening, and if you've enjoyed my podcast, please check out my other podcast, Wired for Autism presents Autism Conversations, a series of informal interviews with fellow autistics. And why not check out my website, wiredforautism.co.uk. Till next time, take care. Bye.